Alrighty. An absolute ton of you have told me that I need to watch this video. It is one atheist versus 20 Christians. This is the atheist, Alex O'Connor. He is super freaking smart. I'm not going to lie. Here's my thoughts on religion before I react to this video. First of all, I am a self-proclaimed Christian is what I call myself, right? I believe very strongly in the Christian moral system. I think it is the best moral system. I think that instilling that upon a country is extremely valuable. I want to be Christian. I attend church. I just don't know if I fully believe in God. I don't think that there's any proof that he doesn't exist. There's also no proof that he does exist. I think that believing in God can be logical. I don't think that there's any contradictions in the Bible to my understanding, but open, blind faith in God is very difficult for me, and it's something that I want to have. So that's kind of where I'm at. That being said, let's watch and see his argument.
To it? Did God command the ethnic cleansing of the land of Israel?
I'm not saying the scribe made something up. I'm saying the scribe has a command.
So where did they get that command from?
From God.
I had Jesus appear to me 3 years
I'm also
ago.
eating,
I don't
by
know
the
what's
way.
happening now. I have to suspect it's some kind of psychological phenomenon. Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast. And today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who, God willing, might be able to change my mind. My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
I disagree. I'd be able to debate this.
Good work.
Hey, Alex, how's it going?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Sage. Why don't you just begin? Why does suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection,
Very well
the
spoken,
mechanism by
yes.
which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been
It's a very good
brutally
argument I've
wiped
never
from
heard
existence
before.
into extinction. And I
Okay.
think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course, we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth. I
like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
Fine by
And
me. So I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
Can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced, right? And so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that
Debating
suffering
against him, I don't
exists.
think
So
is
here's
doing a very good
question.
job.
A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well, because the ultimate view here is that
Okay, pause.
Nice to meet you.
Right, on that last thing, it's very difficult to debate against. I will say. But in general, he creates the laws of the universe, right? And things like this are just going to happen. I mean, the Christian argument is that humans brought this suffering into the world. We brought sin. Sin separates you from God, right? There's a version of the world that exists with sin. Sin is allowing of suffering. And God has a world that does not have suffering. We've just chosen the one that has suffering. It's kind of like the argument, right? Yeah, and then, I don't know. I want to hear him talk more.
Good work.
Alex, my man. Good to
How's it
meet you.
going?
My
Nice to
name's
meet you
Tim.
too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists.
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect.
Right. So he is all loving, but he's just. Just Christian buzzwords is what it's going to sound like, but that's what it is. But he's just. If we are choosing to separate ourselves from him, we're allowing sin into this world. He's going to allow us to live in that world that we've chosen to live in. That world has suffering.
And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on,
Yeah.
horrendous or
In
whatever
particular, non-human animal suffering. Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies.
I will say on the non-human animal suffering, right, God is very much calling humans different than animals, right? He created the animals by Genesis for humans. So I don't know if their suffering is really real suffering. Right? That's kind of hard to define.
Trying to explain why suffering exists.
Yeah.
Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff, none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch
This guy's
between
awesome.
the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals
Great.
and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection such that that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything. The first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores? for
Yes, he
example?
could totally do that.
Okay,
but
so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative, and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo
people
where
have their
there's
flags up? This guy's
victoriousness,
great.
there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem.
I do think what he's talking about is really interesting. The better argument against him, in my opinion, on the animal thing, is animals just aren't as important as humans, right? We perceive them as suffering, but if they aren't humans, they don't have free will, I don't know if they're truly suffering, if they really are anything as God created them for us.
To show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table.
Okay.
But sure, go ahead.
Okay, so are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly, so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way. They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm
Yes.
assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can
Do
talk.
you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that
Yeah,
suffering.
but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why you? What's the term of necessity?
So,
doing here?
so perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize
Okay, so tell me
unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg
Right.
starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, redeemability, or what we call
For the deer?
defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their
Hold on,
life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. You're probably talking about this post-mortem example.
Sure.
I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually
Sure,
see that.
can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer
It's
a
not
bunch.
means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000.
Yeah.
But why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out
All
by
right.
the majority.
Awesome,
Please
man.
return to your seat.
That guy was great. I don't know why they voted him out. I really want to hear his answer to that.
So close. Hey,
Nice to meet you. My
how's
name's
it going?
Hayden. How are you?
Hayden, nice to meet you.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering, needs the existence of the world, that it's theism. But granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Okay.
He's an
why does
incredible
suffering
debater. He's
exist at all?
super smart.
Like in an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
Oh, well, because however life began, it developed through a series of natural selection, which requires animals to develop senses that they wish to avoid in order to be more likely to survive. And that's why pain receptors evolve. In a world where not all of these pains are actually going to kill us, we're left with situations in which we're in a lot of pain but don't end up dying for it.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism
Animals.
cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree
so
with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts. If you don't want to grant the
I would
existence of
agree
the
with him.
material
He is
world before we
shifting
start
the
talking about this,
goalposts.
we can do an argument from consciousness. But then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism.
Is it-
What I'm going to say is this.
Sure.
What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God. But the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came
No,
up with?
tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose,
Well,
for his
if Christianity
creation?
is true, then I think it must be necessary because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're
for it.
not talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not. Because I don't
Okay.
think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you
Sure.
why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody
This guy's
and
being
wants to
cooked
love
now.
everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue?
I gotta wash my hands. I think that this topic is a bit exhausted.
My next claim is that God commands genocide in the Bible.
He does. He does. I mean, there's no debating against this. Like, he's just correct. He does. The Christian argument behind it, and this is something I really struggle with as like a stumbling to be a Christian. So I'm not even gonna watch this debate because he's just correct. I'll listen to one of these just to hear how they try and debate this, but it is correct.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet
Amalekites and Canaanites.
This is a bummer of a
Absolutely
point,
happened.
right? Like when you look at scripture, right?
I agree.
There's a myriad of problematic things we see in scripture, from genocide to misogyny to slavery, right? And I would say that we find genocide in scripture. I would argue, though.
So you agree with my claim?
Yeah, I think it's in scripture. Yeah, I mean, I think it's in there.
Okay,
right?
well, thanks for watching, everyone.
Yeah, this is good.
Yeah, good stuff.
So, I mean, but here's what I would say I ought to do with this
Okay.
claim as a Christian, if you're okay with entertaining that idea, right? So we see mass murder in Scripture, right? And so one of my greatest friends, Rabbi Josh Stanton, he's a rabbi, the Hebrew Scriptures are his. That's where we're finding these genocides, right? And
Yeah,
for-
so to spell it out, we've got, I think the two most problematic are in 1 Samuel 15, the destruction of Amalek, and in the book of Joshua, the destruction of Jericho and the destruction of Ai. So for the sake of the audience who might not know about this, in 1 Samuel, for example, the Amalekites are a Canaanite tribe. They're in the land that's been promised to Israel. Israel are instructed through the prophet Samuel. King Saul is told to completely destroy the Amalekites, leave nothing alive that breathes, kill man and woman, child and infant, cattle and sheep. And in fact, when Israel does as they're instructed, they destroy Amalek, except Saul decides to keep the king as a captive, and he also saves the best of the animals. The prophet Samuel comes to him and says, "What have you done?" And he says, "Well, we kept the best of the animals in order to sacrifice to the Lord." And it says twice that God regrets that he made Saul king. Why does he regret that he made Saul king? Because Saul didn't follow his commandment to completely destroy the Amalekites by keeping the king alive and by keeping the best of the livestock. Saul says, "We kept the livestock alive to burn as a sacrifice to the Lord."
Yeah.
And Samuel says, "What pleases the Lord more, burnt offerings or the following of his commands?"
Sure.
And so we know that we're talking about what I would define here as a genocide.
Yeah, so it's in there, right? And I would say this is a great place where things like progressive Christianity serve us quite well. Not in the idea that God is progressing, but humanity is progressing further to a greater understanding of God's ethic and justice. I would also say when I look at scripture, I would actually be opposite from most of my contemporaries here. I don't read it as 100% literal. Like, I don't need scripture to be a history book, a literal book. So I look and I have to say, well, what is this telling me? And it's a awful story. Might I say a story for us to have to go through and navigate, right? And I would go back to my friend again, who is a rabbi, who we had this conversation.
I don't really like this guy's tone. He's very much like child church instructor is the tone I'm getting.
Just in friendship about how he reconciles with the Holocaust. I haven't been a part of this genocide, but he's talking about the one you're referencing in scripture, right? I wasn't around for it, but this is one that is in relatable human history that we can have family members that we're a part of, right? And for my friend
It's your
who
point, dude.
hasn't had this not compromise his faith, that was the question I asked him,
Red
right? Like, this
flag.
is a genocide that was against your people and your religion, and for people that really loved God.
I don't even
and
want to
deep
listen to this
in our
topic.
My next claim is that there is insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection.
Oh, I love this topic. Oh my god. Oh my god.
Okay. How's it going?
This is a really interdisciplinary question for the
yeah.
resurrection of Jesus.
For starters, the reason that I even started following the Christian faith more is because there is overwhelming evidence to support it. It is not more likely that it happened than it did not, right? I'm not saying that.
And in my experience, it kind of boils down into
Unfathomable
two
amount.
categories. The prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus and the data itself.
So what I'm really interested in is the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay, I want to ask a clarifying question because I would love to talk about the data. But if I were to give you a model of the Gospels that I would call like the historical reportage model, which would say something along the lines of the authors of the Gospels were close to the times and places of the historical Jesus. They rooted their historical work in eyewitness testimony and did not feel the freedom to make up historical facts. Because of that, we can extract all the testimonies from these Gospels And we have access to what the original eyewitnesses actually said and did.
Okay, so
right?
who do you think are the eyewitnesses that the testimony is being based on?
So this is where I'm not a walking encyclopedia, but I would say if you looked at all the testimonies, we have 21 unique testimonies that are going to be polymodal in nature. They're going to have semblances of independence and interdependence and some dependence because of the synoptic problem, all that stuff. If we were to get there, would that be enough for
Red
you
flag.
to say the probability that the resurrection happened relative to any other countering theory is higher?
No, I don't think so.
So that tells me then that, one, it could be the prior probability still. That's an issue. Because if that's not enough evidence.
It's not that. I think that the authors of the Gospels, specifically on the resurrection, can't be trusted to be giving an accurate account of what happened.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking if we had this historical reportage model, and that was true.
Sure, well,
that would be
if it were true that they were reporting historical events, then it would be a historical event, yeah.
So, let me clarify
I don't
one.
think that they
yeah,
are.
Yeah, I get where you're coming. Let me clarify one thing here. The historical reportage model does not entail what the reporting actually happened. All I'm saying is that we can extract from there is that these were the actual eyewitness testimonies to the risen Jesus.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that Jesus is the only person, outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles rose from the dead, do you think that he's the only person in human history that's risen from the dead?
Yes.
Okay, so Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 27, says that at the time of the death of Jesus, the graves of Jerusalem opened, and the holy ones got out of their graves, and
He said, other than the ones that Jesus and the apostles rose from the dead, which is what this is talking about.
interestingly says then
Also, I think most believe that this is a not directly, whatchamacallit, like factual event. It's more like, whatever, like poetic or whatever, but I
the
don't know.
resurrection appeared to many. Many
Yeah.
of them walked around appearing to many. Do you think that that happened?
So I would just say that if the historical reportage model is true, then yes.
So you think
This guy sucks.
Hold on. The problem there is those are also talking about resuscitations most likely, not resurrections.
Yeah, but what we're talking about
So-
here is the graves of Jerusalem opening and many people getting out of their graves, walking around Jerusalem
Sure.
and appearing to
If
many
I
people.
say yes, what's at stake
If
there?
this happened, this would be the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in human history. And yet,
And then you're going to make
it
an
is
argument
not
from
reported.
silence from there.
Some arguments from silence do work. It is
I
not
understand
reported.
that, but then
Hold on,
that's
hold on.
only one piece of
it's not
evidence that you're
reported
gonna use.
anywhere else. It's not reported in any of the other Gospels.
I
It's not in
understand.
Josephus. It's not
So
in Acts.
that's one
It's
data
not
point.
anywhere.
Let's just- well,
so,
for-
but hold on, let me finish this thought because this is important. Most Christian scholars, I think, so people like Dale Allison, for example,
Yeah.
believe that this didn't actually happen.
Well, I'm not
The-
interested in what Allison's going to say.
The door that this opens.
What I'm interested in is what the data says.
The door-
So
well,
if
the-
we have the historical reportage model, right?
But you keep saying we have
Yeah.
this model.
That's fine. Let me give you some evidence for the historical reportage model.
Sure.
If this model is true, one of the things I would expect to see would be things like undesigned coincidences within the Gospels.
Yep. Okay.
Tiny little interlocking
Okay, for the
details.
sake of time, I understand what you're saying. So I think that a lot in the Gospels is historically reliable and a lot is not. Things like undesigned coincidences
So
are
are you
really
taking a
interesting.
pericope by pericope approach to this, or how is what methodology?
I'm taking
are you
a
using?
story by story. I don't think that the
I think
graves.
that's I don't think that's a good
I
methodology.
don't think that the graves of Jerusalem were opened. I don't
So,
think that there were people
that's
walking
fine.
around
I
the city of
understand where you're
Jerusalem.
coming
But
from.
if that's the case, then that means that at least the author of Matthew is willing to invent
I don't
stories
think that's the
of
case.
resurrection
Well,
in
hold
order
on,
to make
you're
a
making
theological
big
point.
inference there, right?
Well, hold on.
because
Okay,
I know that you like to, for instance, you like to talk about the flight to Egypt, and you like to
Sure,
say
yeah.
that Matthew invented the flight to Egypt.
Luke.
No, Luke's the one that doesn't mention it. Matthew's the one that mentions it.
Sorry, Matthew.
It's okay.
Yeah,
It's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, Matthew, and then typically the way you run this argument is Matthew invented the flight to Egypt. Luke doesn't mention it. The reason why Luke doesn't mention it is because it didn't happen. Matthew mentions it, and he tells us why to put Jesus into prophecy. Here's a counter hypothesis.
Sure,
to this.
sure,
What if
sure.
it's just the case that Matthew is not making up historical facts and he's doing some sort of midrash? And what I mean by this is that he's looking at this historical thing that happened, the flight to Egypt, and taking this Hosea passage, which, by the way, would be a kind of a clunky passage to use if you wanted to make up a historical fact for prophecy. Because that Hosea passage is not inherently...
I think we
Well,
might
let
be
me land
getting
the plane here.
slightly off. But I have to be allowed to speak here. I think we're getting slightly off topic. The problem with the birth narrative story is not just that a story is being invented to fulfill prophecy, although we're told that that's why it's done. The problem is that it contradicts the other account. That
Well,
the
I'm
family
totally
goes-
fine with
the
that.
family
So,
stay in
so if you
Jerusalem.
look at the birth narratives altogether, I think there's room for one discrepancy, and that is
That is
that
Egypt and
Luke
Jerusalem?
doesn't mention it. I
Well,
think
well,
that's...
well, Luke says that they go to the temple.
What?
Luke says that they go to the temple.
Yeah,
So hold on.
I'm
Let
going
me-
to agree with you.
Let me finish it. Luke says that the family go to the temple and present Jesus in Jerusalem. Matthew says that they go to Egypt. They're very far away from each other. And we're told that they stay in Egypt until
Yeah.
after the death of Herod. This is a contradiction.
So again, I actually agree.
Okay,
Just-
pause.
Thank
You've been voted
God.
out by the
Holy
majority. Please return
shit.
to your
Sorry.
seat.
Good to see you. Okay, so historical case
This
for
guy's
resurrection.
super
Well,
chatted.
before we get there, actually, my main contention had to do with the example that was just brought up about the flight to Egypt.
I mean, we can talk about it, but what I really want to know here is how we know that the resurrection of Jesus historically
Right,
happened.
okay.
So can I start with the question for
Yes,
you, for
please.
example? Do you believe that the graves opened and that the holy ones were walking around the city of
Yes.
Jerusalem, appearing to many people?
Yes.
Why is this not reported in any other Gospels, any other historical account, anywhere?
This I wanna
mean,
learn
this
about,
is the most extraordinary thing
genuinely.
that's ever happened in human
This is a
history.
question I have.
So the
Also, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt,
please.
but also crucially, Matthew says at the time of Jesus' death, there was a huge earthquake, the
Yes.
second earthquake, the graves opened, and that then the holy ones appeared to people after the resurrection
Right.
to many. So
Right.
there's this very, very strange passage, which seems strange on the surface, but
Right,
also says that the graves opened at the time of the crucifixion, but they weren't walking around and appearing to people until after the resurrection. It seems confused, it seems contrived, unless they were like hanging out dead in open graves for like 3 days until they got up or something. It's a very, very strange passage, which I think has no historicity behind it.
Sure, but that's not the same as the claim you originally brought up, which is the resurrection of Christ himself.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is if that's
So
unlikely...
if I were to, I understand. So if I were to connect the two, what I would say is the historicity for the resurrection of Christ has the same type of data that the historicity of the resurrection of these holy ones in Matthew, because the appearances of these holy ones and the appearances of Christ correlate. They correspond. And so the reports of their appearances is just as likely, like for example, you're aware of the passage in obviously Corinthians 15, which is one of the earliest attestations of the formal traditional creed that states about the resurrection of Christ and the appearance to 500, and this states within 5 years of Christ's resurrection. So,
well, arguably, yeah. I mean,
Right,
it's unclear. I mean, are you referencing...
as I understand, you do grant that possibility.
I grant that Paul's very early. I don't know about 5 years.
Sure. But, well, the tradition on which it's based, because he's quoting a very specific midrashic formula.
I agree,
okay,
but
I
then,
can concede that.
Paul inserts
that's fine.
himself into that formula. He says,
Sure,
finally, he
that's
appeared to
fine.
me. So at some point, the formula stops and
Yeah,
Paul's own words
actually,
begin.
that demonstrates the proof of the formula rather than subverts it.
Sure, but I don't know where the formula ends and Paul begins.
That's fine. My point is to say that there are early attestations that are no different in nature than the attestations of the holy ones that rose from the grave. So,
Because crucially...
so if you reject the resurrection of Christ based on the data of eyewitness testimony, then of course you're going to reject the resurrection or the resuscitation, let's say, either one of the holy ones based on the eyewitness testimony.
Well, it's fine if you believe that. I just know that a lot of Christians don't, so I'd like to establish that first. Otherwise,
Sure,
it's irrelevant.
sure.
Let's forget about
So we did your passage. Can we do mine?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
We can forget about the graves opening thing.
Sounds good. So let's go to Hosea
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Uh-huh.
So in Hosea, you have actually a fantastic example of how the prophecies of Christ are being fulfilled at deeper, multivalent levels. Right? It's a metalepsis of prophetic fulfillment. So to answer the discrepancy between Luke and Matthew, first of all, you have the time of the purification rite for the mother. It lasts 33 days after the circumcision of the infant. And therefore, it's a 40-day period before they're presented at the temple. This takes place before they flee to Egypt. Now, I understand the difficulty in the verse right after Luke's pericope about the presentation of the temple with Zechariah, because it says that they returned to Nazareth.
Yes, he
Right.
says that afterwards they returned to Nazareth.
I understand.
Maybe they went to Egypt in between.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
But can I just say that that may be the case? I think that's an unnatural reading of the case. But I'll just grant you for a moment. Let's say that the birth narratives don't contradict each other. That's fine. Let's say that the birth narratives are not historically unreliable for that reason. Evidence of the resurrection I'm looking for right now.
Sure, I understand that.
But
Yeah.
I get where you want
I
to
wanna jump
address
on
it. But there
the
are
specific
contradictions
point.
in the Gospels.
Okay.
Well, that's a whole nother claim.
So sorry.
yeah,
You've been
no
voted
worries.
out by the majority. Please
Thanks, man.
return
Thank
to
you,
your
appreciate it.
seat.
These are the worst arguments ever, right? Instantly, if I'm arguing this, I'm bringing up Josephus, Tacitus, all of the amount of text that talks about it. Like, they're just using the Gospels.
Okay.
So there's one point you kind of keep going back to is the opening of the graves.
Oh
saying
my
we're not
God.
seeing
Can
that
we stop
anywhere
fucking
in
talking about the
history.
opening of the
I
graves?
kind of agree with what Dan was saying, is this is an argument of silence. So we don't see anywhere in history the destruction of Pompeii being written down through Vesuvius. This is a huge event.
Sure.
Why don't we see that?
But if we had accounts describing Pompeii around the time that happened and they just didn't mention it, you don't think that would be a bit suspect?
Well, we
Great
don't
point.
see anything talking about the destruction of Pompeii.
Sure, but if we had accounts that were written about Pompeii
Yes, exactly.
at the time of the destruction and they didn't mention it, do you think that would be weird?
There are authors around that time. They're talking about major historical events. Why would they not talk about this major historical event?
Yeah, I do think that would be
So
a
we
little
have
bit odd.
accounts written about Jesus in Jerusalem at the time that this extraordinary event was supposed to take place, and they didn't even think to mention it.
So
Can I tell you why I think the story's in there?
Sure.
Because Jesus is supposed to be the firstborn of the dead. And Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet in the Synoptic Gospels, predicting that the end of the world is going to come soon, a general resurrection of the dead, and Jesus is going to be the firstborn of the dead. So I think Matthew invents this story so that these people rise from their grave, but they don't start appearing to people till after the resurrection, because Jesus is the firstborn of the dead, and this is the general resurrection. The reason it's invented is because, of course, after Jesus dies, there is no end of the world, there is no apocalypse, and so Matthew invents this story in order to fulfill that.
I think that's, that's one hypothesis. But I think when we're looking at the Gospels, we have another hypothesis. We have this fact that, we mentioned the undesigned coincidences. You're familiar with that, right? We have the fact that they go through a lot of historical information, so they get geography right. You agree with this?
Oh, yeah.
So would you say that we have authors that are located within this area during this time period?
I don't know if I can say that with confidence, and I think it depends on which Gospel you're talking about.
Well, let's just go like the Synoptics.
The Synoptics. So who do you think is the author of, say, the Gospel of Mark?
I would say it's Mark.
That was John Mark, the author of...
Yeah.
Now, why do you think that?
Well, I think you're just kind of brushing off my question, though. Do you think the authors were in that time period during that, in the location?
I think even if that's the case, I think that the events were written down decades after they happened.
Okay, but we are saying...
But I'm happy to... Let's say that I granted it. Okay, so these accounts are at least based on eyewitness testimony. Fine. So what?
Well, if we have people who are recording true information off eyewitness testimony...
Then why does that true information often contradict itself?
In what way does it contradict itself?
What's the date of Jesus' death? The Synoptics say that it was on the Passover. John has it before the Passover.
So there's a long, convoluted answer to that. It's how they use idioms in the language. I don't want to get into that right now.
What time did Jesus die?
So I don't want to
Mark says that it's 9 in the morning. John explicitly tells us that he's still standing before Pilate at midday.
So here's the thing. I'm going to grant you contradictions. Is that not what we would expect to see from people recording real events?
Not on these matters, I think.
Why not?
I've made this argument myself. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe we'd expect people to sort of misunderstand the points. But if it's clear that the reason why John is putting the death of Jesus before the Passover is to present him as the Passover lamb, then I think we have reason to suspect that it's been done on purpose. In other words, if we can explain why these contradict each other because the authors have different intentions, I think that proposes a better hypothesis as to why they contradict.
So specifically on Jesus' day, I don't have off the top of my head. I know there's an explanation for that, and maybe we could talk later and I could show it to you, but I don't have the top of my head for that.
When Jesus is on the cross, there are two thieves next to him, right? What do they say?
One says, one condemns him, and one says, don't condemn him.
That's what happens in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, which are earlier, both of them mock him on the cross.
Yeah, I don't see that being an issue.
You don't see that as being an issue?
Why would that be an issue?
Because this is quite an important theological point that's being made. Jesus is forgiving his enemies right before his death. This seems to me, if the earlier Gospels, Mark and Matthew, say that this didn't happen, and explicitly says that the people who were on the cross next to him were mocking him, this is a story that Luke has invented.
But
why would Luke invent a story like that to make a theological point, which tells us that the Gospel writers are willing to invent things in order to make a theological point?
I think you're just assuming an invention.
Pause. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
Sorry, we don't have more time then.
Yeah, he does have an amazing point, right? I really do think that he is convincing me that the authors have invented things to make theological points, right? That is definitely the best conclusion of everything here, and he has very good backing for that. I would 100% agree. I still think that you can have authors that are willing to invent things, and there's one thing that they all agree happened for whatever reason that thing happened, right? But he is making an outstanding point. Blue shirt guy's destroying here. Alex O'Connor.
The resurrection, as you know, is the single most important issue in Christianity. If it doesn't happen, as Paul would say, then none of this matters. If it did happen, then everything matters and everything becomes much more important. Do you believe that the disciples of Christ, Paul as well, and others, believed that Christ rose from the dead?
I think that's probably the case.
Okay, so you believe that they truly believe, not that they just made it up.
But can I ask why you believe that they believed it?
Sure. Well, wait. I would say they believed it because it happened. That's
okay. Fine. But how do you know that they actually believed it?
How do I know that they believed it?
Yeah. How do you know that they believed it? How do you know that they weren't lying, for example?
Because they were executed for it. So, for instance,
how were they executed?
Some of them were executed by being sawed in half. Some of them were executed by being beheaded.
How do you know that?
Well, through obviously the tradition and the historicity of the church.
Well, those are two things. There's tradition and there's historicity.
Well, no. So the tradition of the church, the idea is that when you say church tradition or holy tradition, it's not just this idea that, we're just saying things and making things that are in line with Christianity.
Sure.
But it's actually this idea that we are following the trail and the lineage of Christianity.
What I'm looking for is evidence of the apostles' martyrdom for their claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. Only 2 disciples' deaths are recorded in the Gospels. That's Judas, who hangs himself, or there's another contradiction. Yeah, that hangs himself in Matthew, or in the book of Acts, he's described as falling over in a field with his headlong and his guts spilling out. Right? It seems to be a difference. So Judas, also James, the brother of John, who's beheaded by Herod. We're not told precisely why. Every single other death of the apostles relies solely on church tradition. There is no historical evidence that they were martyred, and certainly not that they were martyred for their belief that Jesus was resurrected. In fact, even according to church tradition, the only person, the only disciple, the only apostle that was not martyred for his faith, do you know who it was? John, the one who makes the most theologically fantastical claims of all of the apostles.
But obviously we know that also by the tradition that they tried to kill John by boiling him in oil.
I don't see any evidence that this actually happened outside of church tradition, and I don't trust that church.
But so for instance, what type of evidence would you be expecting to hear by people who do not care about those Christians? So for instance, the people in power in Rome, why would they be writing some, incredible long tales about we are going to kill the Christians because of this, and this, so that we
this
can
goes both
now
ways, right? Why would the enemies
It does go both ways.
These martyrs?
But it's not. It does go both ways, but it's not a disapproval of the resurrection in the same way that it's not a approval of the resurrection either.
Could say,
but he's absolutely right that it goes both ways, and that's what faith is, right? At the end of the day, I think that you can logically believe the resurrection happened, and you can logically believe that it did not happen. I do believe that.
Christian writers be motivated to make such stories up. What I'm saying is that goes both ways.
I will say, if you're thinking purely logically, obviously his argument also makes more sense. But for me, being Christian or believing in something in general is having faith in something without evidence, right? The only ones here who truly have faith, because he doesn't have to have faith in anything, right? Someone not being resurrected is the status quo. Christians are almost attacked because they are the only ones with faith in this argument. They have to believe in something without proof, but there is no pure logical, this for sure did not happen proof. You know what I mean?
No,
it's kind of what they're arguing.
All we have is a tradition, a biased tradition that seeks to establish their martyrdom that tells us that that's what's happened.
But we can know that they wouldn't want to just make this up because some of them also were killed. And when we now track that time later, there are saints in the 200s, 300s, 400s that are killed for having this thing.
But crucially, they're not the eyewitnesses. They're not the people who supposedly saw this happen. So they could easily just be mistaken.
Agreed. But what I am saying is that if those people in the 200s, 300s, 400s are saying that the eyewitnesses were killed and they are holding to this same faith and they are willing also to be killed, do you not think that this says something?
If indeed that is what happened, it means that they heard that the disciples died for their beliefs. That's all we can know. We don't know whether that's true. We don't know whether that's accurate.
Yes, but
by the way, I'm not saying that they didn't.
Right.
I'm just saying that we don't know. In other words, I'm happy to just grant that the disciples did believe in the resurrection of Jesus and that they died for their beliefs. What I'm saying is that when people throw this out as if it's a historically attested fact, it's simply not.
So what happened on Easter morning?
I don't know.
There's only one other option other than obviously that Christ rose from the dead. I would ascertain, and you can disagree if you feel free, it would be that his disciples, people who truly loved him, stole his body and somehow disposed of it.
Well, it could have been somebody else who stole the body.
But what motivation would they have to steal the body and dispose of it?
Grave robbing was quite popular in that time.
The thing with grave robbing, though, I'm curious where they'll go, is they would steal the graves for the spices on the things that they would wrap the body in. And both, I believe, the Roman and the Christian Testament says that the linens and the spices were left and the body was missing. So the only logical reason that the body would be stolen is religious backing.
Around that area. Well, there are guards that are only reported in Matthew. And what does Matthew say about the guards? He's the only person that reports the guards. And what do the guards do? They say that Jesus has disappeared, and the high priests pay the guards to tell people that the body's been stolen. Now, what does Matthew say? He says, and this is a rumor that they went and spread that persists to this day. So the author of Matthew knew that there were people who were saying that somebody stole the body, and intentionally puts these guards there, has this story of the high priest paying them off to spread this rumor in order to combat that rumor. So we know that people in the early church, before the writing of the Gospel of Matthew, thought that the body was stolen. Because even Tertullian talks about, this is amazing, Tertullian talks about a theory that some people were spreading that the gardener had stolen the body of Jesus because he...
I love this guy's face every time. He just looks... You're up there to debate, dude. Why are you looking shocked when he's
didn't want people to come and
Spitting.
spoil his lettuces when they came to see him as a shrine.
And I would agree that both
Facts.
seem illogical. But if we're just going to say that it was robbed, and then these disciples, this group of people, now are just not looking for the body, or that, again, which I would say is even more unlikely, that it is people who someone who did not care about Christ, that now would steal his body, I feel like this would be also very illogical.
Well, there are theories that are suggesting, for example, that the authorities, either the Jewish or the Roman authorities, didn't want this to become some kind of shrine to believers of Jesus to go to after his death, and so they disposed of the body. There are all kinds of theories. Some people think that the body was eaten by dogs. Like, there's all kinds of things that could have happened, which seem pretty spurious and unlikely. But to me, if you're trying to tell me that a man rose from the dead, you're going to have to do a lot more in the way of getting rid of these other...
It would be the only clause that has an external force. Every other clause is also extremely illogical, but the clause where Christ raised from the dead has that
One thing that's missing here is, I mean, you touched on it a little bit. The guy in the blue actually touched on it. Is, right, the Romans disposed of him because he was the king of the Jews, right? So clearly they were slightly afraid of him. So having his body go missing would then be proof of the resurrection. So it makes sense to have guards and make sure that the body is not stolen. And yet the body disappears, right? That argument does make sense from the Christian perspective.
force, and that external force is
so
God.
can you tell
All
me
right,
why...
pause, guys. That's time.
I really like the topic they were talking about. I hope they continue that topic, but that guy was just not there to argue it. I'm yet to see a Christian who's really prepared to talk against this guy, I feel like.
So the
Nice.
first
Take
thing I
your
want
time.
to ask is, do you have to have evidence to prove that something's real? To believe something's real?
Broadly, I think that can't be the case, because there are all kinds of things that we believe without evidence, such as the existence of the external world and the laws of logic, fine. But when it comes to historical claims, I think that, yes, we need some burden of proof.
And how much historical claims do you need in order for you personally to believe that Jesus is real?
I believe that Jesus was real. To believe that he was resurrected is a different thing. I think I would need probably more corroborative accounts of specific appearances that didn't contradict each other.
Okay, what if...
Overall, just to talk about this guy, incredibly intelligent. Super intelligent. Yeah, very well versed. He knows his shit. I would love to have a conversation with him. Not really a debate, but a conversation just to kind of pick his brain and see learn all the evidence. He'd be a great guy to learn
If
from.
I told you that Jesus still is revealing himself to people today?
That's fine, but do you think he's doing so in bodily form to multiple people at once?
Okay,
Oh,
so
God. I had so much faith for her, and she just fucking lit a match, poured it in gasoline.
I
Oh,
believe
my
Jesus
God.
is still alive today, and that he is...
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. We're having a fucking logical conversation here, and you're just bringing it purely emotional. What are we
and delivering
doing?
And it would be absolutely impossible for Jesus' resurrection if Christians didn't have power. So if a Christian was powerless, then Jesus wouldn't have resurrected. But because there's still deliverance, miracles, healing, signs, wonders,
What are we doing? Oh my God.
dreams, that's evidence and that's living proof that Jesus resurrected.
Look at his face. Oh, I'd be laughing.
Because if he didn't resurrect, he wouldn't have sent his Holy Spirit as an advocate to fill the believer to operate and to be empowered to walk.
I'm amazed.
Along with the
40
well-known
flags didn't just
traditions,
shoot
which
up.
also have their visionaries too. As an
Yeah.
outsider, I have to say, I can understand as a Christian, if
Yeah.
you hear the story that someone's seen Jesus, you might think that's plausible and think, you know, praise Christ. For me, I don't find it convincing because I see it happen all over the place. We see all kinds of visions. We see people seeing ghosts. We see people seeing Jesus. We see people saying all kinds of gods. And by the way, that also I don't think would really indicate the historicity of this particular resurrection account of Jesus of Nazareth.
I had Jesus appear to me 3 years ago. I was in my room and he appeared to me and he came and he gave me a big hug. He lifted me up. He turned me around and the joy was unlike this world. And I'm telling you, like, he's so real because I've physically seen him. But, you know, I could say all day my tangible encounters with Christ. I've seen signs, wonders, miracles. I've seen paralyzed people walk out of wheelchairs and not over time. I've prayed over people and I've seen broken bones go back into place. I've seen people delivered of demons. Like, the very things in the Bible I've seen come to life. And in my life, I've seen people delivered of demons. Like, the very things in the Bible I've seen come to life. And my life has been tangible evidence of the living God, of the living resurrection, that he has risen, because I wouldn't be able to see or do.
Oh, this is why people are atheists right here. This is why people are atheists. Nothing against this lady, but like, there are so many Christians that I'll talk to, and they're like, this all the time. It's like, he's here. Like, oh my God, I've seen him. And it's always the people who are just the type of person to make that shit up about a lot of things. You know what I mean? And when that is the loud minority of your group, people are going to be against it. But there are ways to believe in
Any
God
of that
logically.
stuff unless that happened. But as much as I can tell you it, right, it's up to if you want to.
I think it's so funny
I'm
he's just letting her
fascinated
talk.
by your account. I always love to know what people see when they have these kinds of visions, the physicality, how Jesus appeared, did he fade away, did he walk out of the room, did he knock on the door, this kind of stuff. But the crucial point is that if I had such a religious experience, I have no doubt that it would probably turn me into a Christian, and God willing, it will happen one day. That would be awesome. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened yet. And as far as that goes to convincing anybody else, people will say that's not evidence, and it's not, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be for you, it's supposed to be the reason that you have to believe in God, and it's probably the best reason you can have for believing in God. Unfortunately, that's not going to do very much for me, because these stories of sort of demons being driven out and this kind of stuff, you know, I think the only thing that demons seem to be more...
God, I can't. Oh my God. That was the most respectful response of all time. That was the most respectful. As a Christian, or once again, self-proclaimed Christian, I would have fucking laughed in her face. Genuinely. I would love to be a Christian. I would love to do something like this as a Christian talking to more logical Christians, and me bring up my issues and my questions and see if they can convince me. Because I genuinely think, not nearly as well as him, but I could find contradictions that many believing Christians would, you know what I mean? Like I don't want to do this with experts, but like, if I had 25 random Christians from random churches, I could play his role. Because there's so many people that just believe, and they think that they have proof for belief, and this is their proof for belief. And I would just laugh in their face. It's very frustrating. But I still stand by there's logical reason to believe in God.
Jesus is
or
a hammer.
There can be.
You know, if I can see this kind of stuff happen, maybe that would increase my credence. But until it does, I just have to accept that that's something you experienced. That like the apparent visions of the disciples and other people that you've already mentioned, I don't know what's happening there. I have to suspect it's some kind of psychological phenomenon until I'm shown
I would never be good on one of these shows. If they pan the camera to me, I'd just be...
Guys, I'm sorry.
Great video. I don't feel like watching the whole thing, but it is a good video. Thank you guys for sharing it. I'm going to watch more of his stuff. Incredibly intelligent. I like this guy a lot. Even though, once again, I'm Christian. I think listening to logical points from the other side is very valuable. I'm sorry I was eating for most of this. This is a really good video. But that last...